Good, that's working. Well, welcome back. All been well fed?
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for our two new guests. I think you can join us. This afternoon, we're going to have a bit of a look at a story from the Civil War, and it's dealing with the subject of angels, and I thought it would be good to read through this, but I'll do a little bit of an introduction to this subject to sort of lead us into that. But before we do that, for those who can kneel, we will do prayer. Father in heaven, we just thank you that we can meet on this blessed Sabbath day. We just pray for your Spirit to guide us and teach us, that we may know the truth about your character, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. One of the questions that I regularly get asked is in relationship to the ministry of angels, and one of the texts that's brought to me is, of course, the one about the 185,000 Assyrian soldiers that the angel of the Lord smote is the word, as evidence that God's angels have capacity to kill. Heaven help the person who, that angel that killed 185,000 soldiers, if he was assigned to you to be your guardian angel, you'd want to be good, wouldn't you? So, otherwise it could be tough. But there's some statements in the Spirit of Prophecy, and we're just talking about this, about you can read statements in the Spirit of Prophecy, and you can read statements in the Bible, and you can read them in isolation from other statements, and you can make it say what you want it to say if you ignore all the evidence. But the thing we need to do is to put all the statements together to bring things into harmony. And this is one of the statements that comes into my mind when talking about the ministry of angels. And this is a book that most of you are familiar with, this, Smiting Angels, where I was just working through my own, trying to understand different stories in the Bible related to angels and whether they did actually engage in executive judgment and ending people's lives. And this is a statement from the 10th of May 1906 in the Review and Herald, where Ellen White says, "Angels are sent from the heavenly courts." I'll have to print one out. Okay, go and print one. For those of you online, if you go to the latest article on Maranatha Media, it's Slavery and the War. You'll be able to pick up the article that we're looking at. But it says, "Angels are sent from the heavenly courts not to destroy, but to watch over and guard imperiled souls, to save the lost, to bring the straying ones back to the fold." It's an interesting statement. They're not sent from heaven to destroy, which makes sense to me. And you have to put that into context. Smiting angels.
Yeah, it's just intro.
One of the, this is just the introduction. So one of the quotes that people often refer to in the Spirit of Prophecy is Great Controversy 614.2. And I've got it written here, it's on page 39 where I look at this quote, where it says, so you've read that statement, angels are sent from heaven not to destroy but to guard imperiled souls. And then you read this statement in Great Controversy 614.2, a single angel destroyed all the firstborn of the Egyptians and filled the land with mourning. When David offended against God by numbering the people, one angel caused that terrible destruction by which his sin was punished. The same destructive power used by holy angels when God commands will be exercised by evil angels when he permits. There are forces now ready, only waiting for divine permission to spread desolation everywhere. And this statement is used to prove that God's angels killed the firstborn in Egypt, that when David offended, that an angel of God essentially slew 70,000 people. And then it says the same destructive power exercised by holy angels when God commands will be exercised by evil angels when God permits. And again, it's a matter of taking all of the statements together, and what I suggest people do is, first of all, to read that statement in context. If you read the previous paragraph, you get the complete context of that statement. And I think most of us here are familiar. If you want to go into more detail on this, I suggest you read Smiting Angels. I also have a chapter on this in the book Agape, where I'm just using a Bible-only approach dealing with angels of God. And I found it a very, 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 very engaging study to see whether we can fit all of the statements together. And again, like I say, there's a statement where she says, angels are not sent from heaven to destroy. So how do we make that fit? How do we make it fit? Well, we've got to put all the pieces together and make them fit. So we've got this article by Ellen White in the Review and Herald. It is the Review and Herald?
It is.
Yep. 1861, during the time of the Civil War. And I just thought it'd be good for us to read through this story because it gives us some insights into how God deals with nations and how angels are involved in that process. I had made mention of this some time ago about this story, and Colin Linwood just happened to read this article this morning or last night. And this was, I said, this is what I was referring to. So I thought it'd be good for us to go through this. So, says in the first paragraph, God is punishing this nation, that's America, for the high crime of slavery. So the question is, how is God punishing? How was he punishing America for their allowance of slavery? That's an interesting. That's interesting in and of itself, isn't it? By allowing slavery, God is now was punishing the United States. How many other nations had slavery as part of their culture?
England.
England. Yeah.
Most nations.
Most nations have been involved in slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influences. So God is going to punish the northern states of America and the southern states of America. The question is, how does he punish them? All heaven beholds with indignation human beings, the workmanship of God, reduced to the lowest depths of degradation and placed on a level with the brute creation by their fellow men and professed followers of that dear Saviour whose compassion was ever moved as he witnessed human woe, heartily engage in this enormous and grievous sin and deal in slaves and souls of men. Angels have recorded it all. It is written in the book. The tears of the pious bondmen and bondwomen, of fathers, mothers and children, brothers and sisters, are all bottled up in heaven. It's an interesting statement, isn't it? Agony. Human agony is carried from place to place and brought and bought and sold. God will restrain his anger but a little longer. His anger burns against this nation and especially against the religious bodies who have sanctioned and have themselves engaged in this terrible merchandise. Now, what is God's anger? Well, the book that we've been reading, Acts of Our Gentle God, I think you've got a copy of it there, goes through in a very simple way explaining what is God's anger. And what is God's anger? Well, aph is grief, yes, but God's anger is...
allows the consequences that you choose.
He no longer prevents the consequences of our decisions to come upon us. That's God's anger. He's restraining, protecting, holding back. And when it says God's anger is burning, it means the grief of these things going on, he cannot hold back the consequences any longer. He has to allow them to unfold. We have to let the Bible itself to define what God's anger is. And in that book, Acts of Our Gentle God, it's explained very, very well exactly what God's anger is. Remember, it says in Isaiah 55, God's ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts. It's dangerous for us to interpret words in the Bible and use our definitions of those words in English when we should let the Bible itself to define its terms. We are not to define its terms. Let the Bible define its terms. And that takes effort, which is laborious for most people, and they would rather just read it according to their own fancy and get the wrong answer, thinking it's the right answer.
Mercy.
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 Indeed. His anger burns against this nation. We've read that part. It says, such injustice, such oppression, such sufferings, many professed followers of the meek and lowly Jesus can witness with heartless indifference. And many of them can inflict with hateful satisfaction all the indescribable agony themselves, and yet dare to worship God. It is solemn mockery, and Satan exults over it and reproaches Jesus and his angels with such inconsistency, saying with hellish triumph, such are Christ's followers. These professed Christians read of the sufferings of the martyrs, and tears course down their cheeks. They wonder that men could ever possess hearts so hardened as to practice such inhumane cruelties toward their fellow men, while at the same time they hold their fellow men in slavery. That's blindness, isn't it? And this is not all. They sever the ties of nature and cruelly oppress from day to day their fellow men. They can inflict most inhumane tortures with relentless cruelty, which would well compare with the cruelty papists and heathens exercise towards Christ's followers. It will be more tolerable for the heathen and for papists in the day of the execution of God's judgment than for such men. And why is that?
Because with what they should have, they say they're worshipping God, therefore they have, we think that they've got greater light.
Because they're Protestants.
Because they're Protestants. Therefore, in the day of God's judgment, when they are comparing what they've done over their lifetime with God's holiness, the grief that comes upon them, as they understand how far they've fallen short, were greater than those of the
Yes.
papists and heathens who acted mostly out of maybe ignorance. And so it's going to be worse for them. The consequences they bring
The
on
guilt.
themselves were
The guilt will be greater for them. The cries and sufferings of the oppressed have reached unto heaven. Does that remind you of something? The cries reaching unto heaven?
Yeah, that's Israel.
Their bondage in
Their
Egypt?
bondage in Egypt.
And what about the cry of Sodom? It talks about the cry of Sodom. I will go down and see. The cry of Sodom.
Adam's blood cried.
Yeah, Abel's blood cried. And angels stand amazed at the hard-hearted, untold, agonizing suffering man in the image of his Maker causes his fellow man. The names of such are written in blood, crossed with stripes, and flooded with agonizing, burning tears of suffering. God's anger will not cease until he caused the land of light to drink the dregs of the cup of his fury. So, again, we're going to get a definition of what all these things are in the following statements. At the Roosevelt Conference, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting and prayer, Sabbath, August 3, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us. I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery. Slavery has long been a curse to this nation. The fugitive slave law was calculated to crush out of man every noble, generous feeling of sympathy that should arise in his heart for the oppression and suffering slave. It was in direct opposition to the teaching of Christ. God's scourge now is upon the North that they have so long submitted to the advances of the slave power. The sin of the northern pro-slavery men is great. They have strengthened the South in their sin and sanctioned the extension of slavery and acted a prominent part in bringing the nation into its present distressed condition. That bears us to keep in mind there's a different type of slavery that is enslaving our nation. One of the types of slavery is methamphetamine is a type of slavery. And in allowing this product to come into our shores, and I do believe with the technologies that we have today that it would be possible for law enforcement to capture a lot more of the drugs that are circulating than they do, except for the fact that they are being paid off by the mafia in order that these drugs can flow more freely through our towns and cities. Is God's anger burning over these issues? To see these young people in a mess. I saw a picture of a woman that had been, a young woman that had been arrested over 12 times for methamphetamine use. And to see the first picture of this beautiful young woman, and then the next picture, and then the next picture, and by the 12th picture, she is like a skeleton and a scarecrow. Her whole face was contorted and changed. This drug had completely destroyed this young girl in a number of years. And does God weep over these things? And what will be for those who actually engaged in enslaving these young people in these things? So I was shown that many realise not the extent of the evil which has come upon us. They have flattered themselves that the national difficulties would soon be settled and confusion and war end. But all will be convinced that there is more reality in the matter than was anticipated. Many have looked for the North to strike a blow and the controversy to be ended. I was pointed back to ancient Israel, held in bondage by the Egyptians. The Lord wrought by Moses and Aaron to deliver the children of Israel. Miracles were performed before Pharaoh to convince him that they were especially sent of God to bid him to let Israel go. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened against the messengers of God, and he reasoned away the miracles performed by them. Then the Egyptians were made to feel God's judgments. They were visited by plagues. While suffering under the effect of the several plagues, Pharaoh counseled to let Israel go. But as soon as the cause of their suffering was removed, his heart was hardened. His mighty men and counselors strengthened themselves against God and endeavoured to explain the plagues as the result of natural causes. Each visitation from God was more severe than the preceding one. And again, this is interesting that Ellen White is using the story of the plagues as a parallel to the judgments that came upon America and how those judgments came upon America. And it wasn't God himself that did it, but he allowed these things to unfold. We read that part. From the king upon the throne down to the most humble and lowly was there wailing and mourning. Then Pharaoh commanded to let Israel go. After the Egyptians had buried their dead, Pharaoh relented that he had let Israel go. His counselors and mighty men tried to account for their bereavement. They would not admit that the visitation or judgment was from God, and they pursued after the children of Israel. When the Israelites beheld the Egyptian host in pursuit, some upon horses and some in chariots and equipped for war, their hearts failed them. The Red Sea was before, the Egyptian host behind. They could see no way of escape. A shout of triumph burst from the Egyptians to find Israel completely in their power. The Israelites were greatly terrified. The Lord commanded Moses to bid the children of Israel to go forward, to lift up the rod and stretch out his hand over the sea and divide it. He did so, and lo, the sea parted, and the children of Israel passed over dry shod. Pharaoh had so long withstood God and hardened his heart against his mighty wondrous works that he in blindness rushed in the path God had miraculously prepared for his people. That's interesting, isn't it? He rushed in. And we just make the point there that it says in the Bible that the angels of God were pulling off the chariot wheels and slowing them down. So if the angels were actually involved in destroying them, why didn't they just kill them? Why did they pull off their chariot wheels? Why did they were trying to stop them from going in. Maybe that's what they were doing. Again, Moses was commanded to stretch forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its strength, and the waters covered the Egyptian host, and they were drowned. So Maybe someone with a loud voice can read the next paragraph for me.
This scene was presented before me to illustrate the selfish love of slavery, the desperate measures the South would adopt to cherish the institution, and the dreadful lengths to which they would go before they would yield. The dreadful system of slavery has reduced and degraded human beings to the level of the brutes, and the majority of slave masters regard them as such. Their consciences have become seared and hardened as with Pharaoh's, and if compelled to release their slaves, their principles are unchanged, and they would make the slave feel their oppressive power if possible. It looked to me like an impossibility now for slavery to be done away. God alone can wrench the slave from the hand of his desperate, relentless oppressor. All the abuse and cruelty exercised toward the slave is justly chargeable to the upholders of the slave system, whether they be southern men or northern men.
I'll read it.
The North and the South were presented before me. The North had been deceived in regard to the South. They are better prepared for war than has been represented. Most of their men are well skilled in the use of arms, some of them from experience in battle, others from habitual sporting. They have the advantage of the North in this respect, but have not, as a general thing, the power of endurance and the valour that the Northern men have.
Wonder why that is. Why didn't they have the valour that the northern men did? Because they knew in their hearts that slavery was wrong.
Probably, yeah.
That's why.
Really deep down, yeah.
I had a view of the late disastrous battle at Manassas, Virginia. It was a most exciting, thrilling, distressing scene. They're not words that we'd typically put together now, would they?
No.
Would we? The Southern Army had everything in their favour and were prepared for a dreadful contest. The Northern Army was moving on with triumph, not doubting but that they would be victorious. Many were reckless and marched forward boastingly as though victory were already theirs. As they neared the battlefield, many were almost fainting through weariness and want of refreshment. They did not expect so fierce an encounter. They rushed into battle and fought bravely, desperately. The dead and dying were on every side. Both the North and the South suffered severely. The Southern men felt the battle, and in a little would have been driven back still further. Northern men were rushing on, although their destruction was very great. Just then an angel descended and waved his hand backward. Instantly there was confusion in their ranks. It appeared to the northern men that their armies were retreating, when it was not in reality so. And a precipitate retreat commenced. It seemed wonderful to me. Then it was explained that God had this nation in his own hand and would suffer no victories to be gained faster than he ordained, and no more losses to the northern men than in his wisdom he saw fit, to punish the North for their sin. And in this battle, had the northern army pushed the battle still further in their fainting, exhausted condition, a far greater struggle and destruction awaited them, which would have caused great triumph in the South. God would not permit this, and sent an angel to interfere. The sudden falling back of the northern troops was a mystery to all. They knew not that God's hand was in the matter.
It's a bit of that unpack, isn't it?
Wow.
So God was seeking, if I'm reading this correctly, if the North had pushed on in their exhausted state, they would have suffered much greater losses.
Yeah.
And so the angel bade them retreat with a waving of the hand. Obviously they didn't see an angel, they just suddenly felt the vibration and were startled and discomforted by the angel, and they retreated. So, and in this retreat, it prolonged the war, punishing both the North and the South. But again, how is God punishing? How is the punishment occurring?
Seeing it to go along.
Punishing each other.
They're punishing each other. They are killing each other. They have decided to do this action. They have decided to do these things. And God is intervening in places both to protect and to allow sin to punish sin. But he is not killing anyone.
No.
The angel did not kill anyone. He simply waved his hand back and they were dispersed. Yep.
The destruction of the southern army was so great that they had no heart to boast. The sight of the dead, the dying, wounded, gave them but little courage to triumph. This destruction, occurring when they had every advantage, and the North great disadvantage, caused them great perplexity. They know that if the North had an equal chance with them, victory is certain for the North. Their only hope is to occupy positions difficult of approach, and then have formidable arguments to hurl destruction on every hand. Arrangements, yeah, to hurl destruction on every hand.
Someone else want to read the next?
The South have been strengthening themselves greatly since their rebellion first commenced. Then if active measures had been taken by the North, this rebellion would have been speedily crushed out. But that which was small at first has increased in strength and numbers until it is the most powerful rebellion. Other nations are intently watching this nation, for what purpose I was not informed, and are making great preparations for some event.
We just inserted this particular point. For those elements in this church, the Adventist Church, when the Adventist Church has voted not to approve women's ordination, for those unions and divisions that go ahead and do it, how does God look upon this rebellion? And what will be the consequences? It's just something to think about. To go against what is being said, what has been voted. And as I've said to people before, we have absolute proof that nobody in the church believes that the voice of God exists in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because if they did, they wouldn't keep agitating this issue, which means they don't believe that when the church votes, that it is the voice of God.
Until they get what they want.
Until they get what they want, which means they don't believe God is leading them. Not in their heart. Impossible.
Carry on.
Yep.
The greatest anxiety now exists among our national men. They are in great perplexity. Pro-slavery men and traitors are in their very midst. And while they are professedly in favour of the Union, they have an influence in decisions, some of which even favour the South. It's very interesting, isn't it?
Did you use a paragraph?
Sorry, did we?
Do we use a paragraph? Or wasn't
I
it?
don't know. No?
You fell asleep like me for a bit.
Keep going.
Yep.
I was shown the inhabitants of the earth in the utmost confusion. There was war, bloodshed, want, privation, famine, and pestilence in the land. And as these things were without, God's people began to press together and cast aside their little difficulties. Self-dignity no longer controlled them. Deep humiliation took its place. Suffering, perplexity, and privation caused reason to resume its throne. And the passionate and unreasonable man became sane and acted with discretion and wisdom.
That's an interesting principle, isn't it? How that suffering, perplexity, and privation can cause reason to resume its throne. It's a shame it has to be that way. When a nation has followed down a practice that is self-destructive, God has to allow punishments to occur to cause reason to return.
Sandy provided.
Is that not the prodigal when he came to his right mind?
Because he was suffering privation,
Yes.
hunger, pain,
Complexity.
and reason returned.
Yes.
My attention was then called from the scene. There seemed to be a little time of peace. Then the inhabitants of the earth were again presented before me, and everything was in the utmost confusion again. Strife, war, and bloodshed, with famine and pestilence, raged everywhere. Other nations were engaged in this confusion and war. War caused famine, want and bloodshed caused pestilence, and then men's hearts will fail them for fear. That's an interesting sequence, isn't
It
it?
is very interesting.
Nations were engaged in this confusion of war. War caused famine. Want and bloodshed caused pestilence. And then men's hearts will fail them for fear and for the looking after those things which are coming on the earth. And that's a sequence that is going to happen. The unbelieving world will soon have something to think about besides their dress and appearance, and their minds are torn from these things by distress and perplexity. They have nothing to turn to. They are not prisoners of hope, and therefore do not turn to the stronghold. Their hearts will fail them for repining and fear. They have not made God their refuge, and he will not be their consolation then, but will laugh at their calamity. That's an interesting. We're having a discussion about this in our online group. Does God laugh at people's calamity? It says there that he'll laugh at their calamity.
Again, his ways are not our ways. How does he laugh at calamity?
In the perception of the people, as it says in Exodus 24:17, the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire in the eyes of the people. It will appear that God laughs at them in their own minds. That's why when God spoke, "This is my son, hear him," to some it thundered. They heard thunder. To others they heard the voice of an angel. So it's the perception of how we understand things as to how this plays out. They have despised and trampled upon the truth of God's word. They have indulged in extravagant dress and have spent their lives in hilarity and glee. They have sown to the wind, they must reap the whirlwinds. In the time of distress and perplexity of nations, there will be many who have not given themselves wholly to the corrupting influences of the world and the service of Satan, who will humble themselves before God and turn to him with their whole heart and find acceptance and pardon. And so we see here the involvement of angels in the civil war, how that God, by a wave of the hand, changed the course of the war. And I want to read you something from Great Controversy, page 117, in relationship to, a number of encounters. But
Was that the battle they influenced William Miller?
Yes.
yes, there would have been angels involved there too.
And he saw that the North should have prevailed, but they didn't.
You're talking about Miller's War?
Miller's and
That was British, the British versus the Americans.
Independence with not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great Controversy, page 117. It's page 118. Yes, there it is. It says, this is during the Dark Ages. Thus, the second time, a vast army sent forth by the most powerful nations of Europe, a host of brave warlike men trained and equipped for battle, fled without a blow before the defenders of a small and hitherto feeble nation. We see the same principle. Here was a manifestation of divine power. The invaders were smitten with supernatural terror. How does that occur? Well, an angel comes and
So that's not sort of the North we just heard about.
the northern tribes, suddenly they're in confusion and they're in disarray, and an angel comes, and in this particular case, they were fine. It says a manifestation of divine power. The invaders were smitten with the supernatural terror. He who overthrew the hosts of Pharaoh in the Red Sea, who put to flight the armies of Midian before Gideon and his 300, who in one night laid low the forces of the proud Assyrian. So she's telling all these stories are all connected to this principle of a supernatural terror or a confusion coming upon an army. Had again stretched out his hand to wither the power of the oppressor. There were were they in great fear, where no fear was, for God hath scattered the bones of him that encampeth against thee, thou hast put them to shame, because God hath despised them. And so we see in that story, as I talk about again here in Smiting Angels, that an angel caused terror to come upon these 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And when you read Josephus, he said that a great plague went through and wiped out the whole army. And it makes complete sense that if you are fatigued and tired in battle, and then you go through this tremendously supernatural terror and anxiety, do you think that it could affect your immune system? And so then a plague goes through, because they're malnourished, they're not eating properly, and a plague goes through and wipes them out. So how did the angel of the Lord slay the 185,000 Syrian soldiers? He waved them back. And they were in terror and agony, and then that allowed all the other events to take place because of their terror. So, and of course, when an evil man encounters a spiritual being, how great will his terror be? I mean, how great was Daniel's terror when he saw an angel?
Yeah. Fell down.
He fell down. Well, how much greater will be the terror of someone that is evil? So it's all commensurate with that. So, any other thoughts? That's all we're all looking at this afternoon. Or any other questions we should look at or discuss before we close?
Wasn't it the story of Balaam the donkey when the angel was seeing they with drawn sword and slain him if the donkey hadn't stopped, and therefore he smote the donkey 3 times?
Yes, we have that story in here, I think. Balaam. So, Numbers 22:29, it's in the beginning of this book. Who is the one that had the sword drawn with an angry face to begin with? Numbers chapter 22. Lunch is kicking in. It's all right for me up the front, preaching. Keeps awake. 22. We want to look at 22 and 23. And God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Now he was riding upon his ass and his 2 servants. The ass saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and the ass turned aside out of the way, and went into the field, and Balaam smote the ass. So there's the angel of the Lord with his sword drawn. Okay? And this is where, if you come down to verse 29, it says, And Balaam said unto the ass, Because thou hast mocked me, I would there were a sword in mine hand, for now I would kill thee. So what is the angel reflecting back to Balaam?
His own thoughts.
His own thoughts. And I think I mentioned here how that when the angel appeared to Joshua, in the book of Joshua, he appeared as a man in armour with a sword drawn. But he did not appear as if he was going to strike Joshua, because Joshua did not have thoughts of anger or aggression to strike anyone. So Christ appeared in the manner that Joshua was, with a sword, as he was. And so it was reflected. There was no anger, there was no aggression. But when Balaam appears that he wants to slay the donkey with a sword, the angel appears in exactly the same manner as what Balaam is thinking. And this is where so many times people get confused. What? And this is simply following out the process of Romans chapter 5. Moreover, the law entered to cause sin to abound. How does God cause sin to abound in us?
Reveals.
He reflects back to us our thinking and our expression. That's how he causes sin to abound. It's reflected back to us so that we may repent of what we were going to do.
But don't they say that in communication, that you should reflect back what someone says to you so you can make sure you're following their correct pathway of what they're saying? Like, did you say blah, blah, blah? Or is that what you wanted to do? So we
Yes,
say
they call it
nowadays.
mirroring.
Yes.
Just feeding back. There was actually a computer program in the early 80s that was developed where it would just ask people questions and it never told anyone what to do. It simply reflected back to them their own thinking, and people became addicted to this computer program, and they started telling them all their secrets and all the thoughts of their inner heart, because the computer never told them what to do. It just simply reflected back to them what they were thinking. And in this program, they said how that through this principle, that this is how they have developed social media. Social media is designed to feed back to you what you want to hear and what you are thinking, not to challenge you, but to give back to you. So on Facebook or on YouTube or whatever, they only give stuff to you that reinforces what you're thinking. Suggested lists. But they're guessing what you might be thinking without trying to cross or challenge you. They give you what you want to hear to create an echo chamber.
Other people who have viewed Maranatha Media,
Huh?
other people who have viewed Maranatha Media would watch this. You've noticed that?
Is he talking rock up there, or?
All sorts of things.
Yeah, all sorts of things.
I thought, I don't think I'd watch that.
Yes. Or maybe they're trying to suggest, this is in the cuckoo land environment, so everyone bring your tinfoil hat. And yes. So again, I go up in greater detail on the story of Balaam in Smiting Angels. You can look at it there, but the principle is to reflect back to Balaam what he's thinking. So, all right.
That's short and sweet.
That was good.
All right. Let's.
Powerful article, wasn't it?
It's very good. Showing how the angel and the fact that it drew in the story of Pharaoh, relates to the story of Pharaoh, and what will happen at the end time in terms of how angels are involved. And again, the angel didn't kill any of the men of the south, didn't kill any of the men of the north, he just waved his hand. And the punishment came about by the men killing each other. So,
Sin punishing sin.
yep.
Sin was sin.
But also the intervention prevented more deaths than could have happened.
It prevented more deaths in that immediate situation that would strengthen the south. It did prolong the war,
Okay, which meant more deaths.
but the reason that was necessary is because through suffering and privation it would bring them to reason. That was the process. That when men are discomforted to the point of despair, they begin to think more reasonably. Otherwise God wouldn't have to do these things, allow these punishments to come.
Oh, sorry.
Quite comfortable there, my dear?
Sorry, yeah. Tony has written a comment.
Tony Milikich?
That's the one. Isaiah 57:17. For the iniquity of his covetousness was I wroth, and smote him. I hid me, and was wroth, and he went on frowardly in the way of his heart. That kind of
There we
is
go.
what you're talking about.
Isaiah 57,
57:17.
17.
About hiding his face.
Yeah.
About hiding his face, yeah. Allowing them. Okay. Well, let's... Father in heaven, we just thank you for the opportunity to study some of these stories. We thank you for your angels that protect us and that watch over us and keep us safe. We thank you that they keep your commandments and they do not kill or destroy anyone, but are like Jesus, gracious, loving, kind, patient, watching over, protecting, and to bring confusion to those who would do greater evil. And Lord, we just pray as we continue to study the scriptures, we would understand fully your character. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Anyone wants the Smiting Angels? I've got some.
Very well.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.